What do the Eastern Church Fathers have to say about the problem of evil? Part one of the answer is coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. By the way, I hear, I'm not an expert, but I hear that supposedly the algorithm on things like YouTube, for example, responds more favorably to comments and that type of interaction, more so than likes. So yes, love the subscribe, love the likes, please, yes, please, more of that. But also, don't be bashful about weighing in and sharing your thoughts, even pithy remarks. Apparently, it helps the algorithm. And so if you want YouTube to know, hey, people should be listening to this, you tell them by jumping into the comments there. So when we started this series, I had promised a certain roadmap that we were going to delve into the problem of evil, a problem that I take very seriously, a problem I've devoted a lot of time to over the years. Wrote my master's thesis on this back when I was actually a process philosopher and I was attacking Latin Christianity. Wrote my doctoral dissertation on Gottfried Leibniz and the problem of evil. I've published on the free will defense and the Eastern Church Fathers. Just finished up a book on Leibniz and the problem of evil that's coming out from Routledge later this year. And I've also got brewing a whole bunch of stuff related to the Eastern Church Fathers and the problem of evil that I do hope to compile into a book at some point in the not so distant future. So be watching for that. If you're enthusiastic about that, go ahead and tell me. There you go, an opportunity in the comments. But that's one of the reasons why when I started down this road, I had suggested, okay, I think there's really going to be sort of three things that we walk through. And so far, we've actually done this. I've stuck true to this. The first one was just sort of going through some of those staples of the free will defense, sort of thing that you can find in the early Christians, be they Latin, or Greek or other, or also you can find it in the medievals, you can find it in modern philosophy, you can find it in contemporary philosophy of religion. And those were the sorts of staples where I talked about the idea that evil is not a substance, it's a privation or a twisting. We talked about the free will defense, which is obviously the centerpiece of most responses, Christian responses to the problem of evil. And then we also talked about the permissive will of God and how that sort of naturally unfolds from the free will defense. And then with that, we also talked about some dynamics, the antecedent and consequent will of God, where God desires good and repels evil, but permits it for certain reasons. And then that led us into sort of this advocacy of a long vision, right? The idea that we can't really sort of judge the nature of our world, the goodness of our world, or its badness, without considering the whole of the picture. And of course, part of that picture within Christian tradition, in Judeo-Christian tradition, is the idea that one day God will raise the dead, call all to account. There will be judgment, and there will be reward for the righteous and punishment for the wicked, and all things will be made new. So that's what we covered in episode 1. Now, in episode 2, we delved into some specifics where I was drawing largely on Leibniz. But of course, as I pointed out, Leibniz draws his insights from, certain church fathers, medieval scholastics, and as well as his own ideas. And so I talked about the vast goodness of our world, this being something that we oftentimes neglect when we talk about the problem of evil. And we simply delve into the blemishes on the world without considering the vast goodness, which Leibniz thinks is rather important when considering whether or not God ought to have made a different world. We also talked about the complexities of divine providence, what Leibniz talks about as incompossibility and concomitance, the idea that certain possibilities exclude other possibilities and entangle other ones. And when we explored that, we saw that divine choice is actually much more complex than the typical objector actually grants it, right? We oftentimes very casually say, well, of course God could do this. We don't really consider the ways in which that simple suggestion spiders out into an entire cosmos or an entire history or something like that. And then with that, we also talked about Leibniz's confidence that God does things in the best possible way, which is not actually an assessment of, his personal happiness or lot in life or something like that. It was a confidence drawn from just the nature of God, from his omnibenevolence, his omniscience, that sort of thing. And then with that, we also touched on things like skeptical theism, right? The idea that suggests the sort of complexity of our world and of world history and of the entire story and all the rest is actually so vast that we're not actually, epistemically speaking, in a position to actually make a judgment whether or not our world is in some way deficient and therefore indict God. Because given these complexities that we explored, it's just evident that our epistemic limitations prevent us from actually making those sorts of judgments. So anyway, those were some of the things that we talked about in episode 2. So pretty much everything that I touched on those first 2 episodes, they're really sort of standard stuff, right? If you read anything within the Western tradition, it's pretty standard that what you'll find the conviction that evil is a privation. It's actually not a substance. Christians are not metaphysical dualists. They don't believe that evil is either an illusion or that there are 2 competing substances, right? That matter is evil and spirit is good or something like that. So that's pretty standard. You'll find the free will defense, and you can find that in traditional classic texts on the problem of evil. You can dig it up in Aquinas if you wanted. You can dig it up in Leibniz, or you could read it in contemporary writers. Again, it's a staple of the entire sort of Christian response to the problem of evil. The consideration of the entire story, you can find that in people like Eleanor Stump, right, whose book on pain goes through all these sorts of stories and shows the ways in which these sort of complex goods emerge out of it, the ways in which these stories end up being conducive to the ultimate good of the individual and of human flourishing and happiness. You find the defense of complex goods in people like Richard Swinburne, for example. And you also find clear free will defenses, well, again, in everybody. Most prominently today, you would find it in Alvin Plantinga, whose free will defense is sort of well known, specifically because he explores the question of, is a sinless world possible? And he concludes, well, maybe not. And we talked about some of those arguments that we had touched on there. And so really, and then obviously incompossibility and concomitance, that's famous it's famous in Leibniz, but it also shows up in Plantinga's work as well, and in other writers. So really, whether you're talking about more classic Latin texts, whether you're talking about reading up on Augustine in the Problem of Evil, or Aquinas in the Problem of Evil, or reading Leibniz in the Problem of Evil, or reading these contemporary philosophers of religions, you can find actually all of the different things that we touched on in the first 2 episodes. But where I see a gap in a lot of the current literature, which is what prompts me to want to do a book on the problem of evil and the Eastern Church Fathers, is the insights that you find from these Eastern Fathers. And so part of that has to do with just the difference in theology and worldview. Inevitably, as the Latin West grew up and was influenced by Augustine and developed in its sort of scholastic traditions, and then was received in Protestantism, you end up getting a very different picture of the world, of God, of providence, of Christianity in general than what you get in the Eastern Church Fathers. And those narratival differences, I think, really do matter. So this is something that I talked about really at length in the series that I did on the problem of divine hiddenness. So if we're going to say, for example, that God is hidden and he ought not to be hidden, we need to actually answer the question, well, what would it mean for God not to be hidden? And are we proposing something that is meaningful? Also, is there good reason why within our world that God is hidden? And of course, in my 3rd episode, I'm not going to rehash all that, but I talked about certain things about how the Eastern Church Fathers understand the structures of the world, the nature of divine providence, the ways in which we and God interact, and some very good explanations for why in our current state of affairs, God is in fact hidden. And so in the same way, when we talk about the problem of evil, it's really important what sort of narrative we're dealing with, right? What sort of world are we in? What is God up to? What sort of God are we talking about? What sort of creatures are we talking about? And of course, that's all really important to answering these types of questions. As I pointed out, most of the anti-proofs, really, I would say probably all of the anti-proofs, are really, at the end of the day, they are in some ways moral indictments. So whether you're talking about the problem of pain or the problem of divine hiddenness or the problem of evil or something like that, you're really sort of leveling an objection that says it's a moral indictment, right? God ought to have done things in a different manner. And so part of the question that's always being asked or, being offered in response to that is really sort of answering whether or not that's true, right? And when addressing that sort of question, the type of God that you're talking about, the type of world you're talking about, the type of creatures you're talking about really matter. And so this is one of the reasons why, like when answering these sorts of questions, what you see is there is a great deal of attention paid to the attributes of God, right? I've talked about qualified omnipotence, the idea that Christianity has not traditionally ever said that God can do anything that might just sort of fall out of our mouths, right? So just because we can put together the words that say, well, God should make a world without sin, or God should make free creatures that aren't free, or God should make square circles or whatever. Just because those words are all taken individually intelligible doesn't mean that we've actually said something meaningful. And so Christianity has traditionally held that, the structures of logic actually originate from God. They're reflective of the order of the world, the nature of the world. And so for this reason, nonsensical contradictions are not actually things at all. They're meaningless utterances. They are nonsense, semantic nonsense. So when you say, a square circle, you're putting together a set of words that don't actually make sense. It's not coherent. And just because you put God can in front of it doesn't all of a sudden make it coherent, because as C.S. Lewis puts it, nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk of God. So the traditional Christian view has always been, and we'll talk about some of the, when I say the traditional Christian view, I mean like confessionally Christian. It was central to the patristic understanding of what Christianity is per se. The traditional Christian view that God is omnipotent has never meant that God can just sort of violate the laws of logic. Rather, it means that anything that is possible, God can do. But there are limits to possibility. There are logical boundary lines to what is possible. And so that's always been an important part of answering, well, what type of God are we talking about? And that's also one of the reasons why many contemporary sort of very non-traditional theists have diverged from certain views of, say, divine foreknowledge. Now, there are certain logical reasons why they diverge from this, right? Aristotle, for example, didn't think future statements had any meaning because, there's no substance to the future. It's not a thing yet. And so it had no referent. And so having a referential view of truth, they thought they were meaningless. But traditionally, theists, right, have classical, Christian theism has always held that future contingents are meaningful. It's meaningful to say, I will eat breakfast tomorrow, and God knows whether that's true or false. And so traditionally, Christianity has advocated divine foreknowledge. And that's also largely based on biblical evidence, the fact that God tells you certain things about the future. But there has emerged, right, these non-traditional forms of theism, like open theism and process philosophy, who think that, evil and free will and just sort of these logical problems about it indicate that it's probably not true that God knows the future. And they actually think this is really important to answering the problem of evil, because if God can just sort of look out and deal in these futurities and say, well, if I do this, this will happen, I do that, that'll happen, that in some ways God might be more culpable than he would be if he doesn't know, right? He chooses the best course of action, and there are sort of surprises, as it were. Now we'll talk about some of that, because that does relate to the Eastern Church Fathers. The Eastern Church Fathers are not open theists, they're not process philosophers, but they do have some rather surprising things to say about divine foreknowledge. But we're not there yet. Right. My point here is to say that when the theist is sort of making defense of God against the anti-proof, it's really important to answer the question of what does it mean, right? What sort of deity are we talking about? And the free will defense is the same way. Right. When we're answering, well, what sort of creatures is he dealing with? And you start to say, well, they're free, they're rational, they're self-aware, they're self-determining. He can't determine their actions for them. That's also relevant, right? So in all of this, the point is to say that the meta-narrative, right, the narrative about the world, about creatures, about God, about the nature of God-world interaction, it all very much matters. Because the objection is suggesting something about God and what God ought to do. And part of the question is, well, is that meaningful? And it's only meaningful if God is a certain way, if creatures are a certain way. But if all of a sudden the picture changes, if we determine that creatures actually are free and self-determining, then maybe it's not so obvious. If we determine that God actually can't just do anything that, we might utter or come up with, then of course it's less potent. And so all of these things are sort of really important when delving into the question. Now, and this I would actually say is in some ways really instructive. At least this helps frame the way I tend to approach these problems. So when I approach the problem of evil, there's no part of me that is anxious that the problem of evil is going to somehow demonstrate that God doesn't exist. And there's a variety of reasons for that. First of all, if you look at my case for realism, you'll see that I actually do think just the sort of nature of our faculties forces us to believe in God, right? And so I'm absolutely convinced that in order to be a coherent, clear, rational thinker who avoids self-referential incoherence, right, in their worldview, you have to advocate properly functioning faculties. That means you have to advocate realism, and you very quickly fall into, well, you also have to believe in God. So there's no part of me that thinks that the problem of evil might somehow undermine that, because I would have to follow the logic of the argument. And in following logic, well, I'd have to be a realist, and therefore I'd have to believe in God. The other thing is also something that I pointed out in the first episode, which is that I pointed out that I don't think evil of the kind that the argument presumes actually can exist in the atheist's world. And so for that reason, since one of the key premises is that evil exists, I couldn't advocate the argument and conclude atheism. So there's no part of me that when I tackle this sort of problem that I'm fretting over, oh no, might this actually demonstrate the non-existence of God? I don't find it compelling in that sort of way. However, I do find it extremely instructive because it is raising a very real conundrum. The fact of the matter that God is omnipotent, that he is omniscient, that he is omnibenevolent, and yet somehow there is evil in our world. Well, that does create sort of data points that we have to reconcile. And I think the reconciliation of those, the wrestling with those, of how can this type of God fit with this type of world and these types of creatures and this type of phenomenon, I think all of that is instructive. And so I take these problems seriously, like the problem of evil or the problem of pain or the problem of divine hiddenness or whatever it might be, because I think it is actually a very useful tool in helping us better understand the world and God and us and God-world relations. And so this is where I would, my whole point in this is to say that I think the meta-narrative really does matter. And the more a meta-narrative struggles to actually make sense of the data, the more it's suspect. Whereas the more comfortably it fits with the data, the more it makes sense of the data, the more likely it is that it is true. And as we'll see, I think the Eastern Church Fathers always offer us the best meta-narrative for understanding all of the sort of data points that we have to wrestle with. And obviously, I thought that was true. It's obvious that I think that's true. I became Eastern Orthodox, and those of you who don't, know my work or this podcast might be new here, you can go and listen to my wild ride to Orthodoxy, where you'll find how my philosophical journey ultimately led me to Eastern Orthodoxy. Obviously, also in terms of divine hiddenness, I think, the Eastern Church Fathers, the Eastern patristic answer to the problem of divine hiddenness is the best possible answer, which you can get in the sort of third and fourth installment. I think it got broken into two, right? Third and fourth installment on the problem of divine hiddenness. And so it is here when we delve into the problem of evil. I do think they have the best insights to not only shore up the elements that we find in other places, but also to add additional elements that I think are really fascinating and deeply helpful in making sense of our world. So with that, let's delve in to the Eastern Church Fathers and the problem of evil. Now, at the risk of being redundant, I do want to rehash some of the elements, sort of re-till the soil that we've already touched on in order to affirm that the Eastern Church Fathers do actually have these things and flesh out whatever additions we might find there, because I think that will be the best springboard into these newer elements. So just like last time, we started with the first episode, we started with the question of what is evil. And I talked about how the Christian view has always been that evil is a privation, right? It rejects the idea that evil is just sort of a subjective unpleasantry, right? That evil is an illusion. It rejects that. Evil is actually a real feature of our world. But by real, it doesn't mean substantive. And this is where the Eastern Church Fathers, like the Latin Church Fathers, all reject the idea that evil is a substance, right? It is not either, right, a two-principle world like in Manichaeism where spirit is good and matter is evil. That's not the case, right? All that God makes is good. And it's also not a two-principle sort of thing where there are two gods, right? Where, well, you have the good God and he's at war with the evil God, and you have two eternal principles in conflict, like you might find in Empedocles, for example. It's not that sort of thing. And so instead what you have is you have the idea that we've already talked about, where all that God creates is good. Being itself is good, right? Existence is good, right? The intelligibility of being, whether you're talking about something very simple, right? These sorts of structures that you find in rocks is good, or when you find these additive perfections, to use the medieval term, like life in plants, that's good. When you find, when you find sentient, beings like animals, those are good, right? Those additional properties are good, rational beings on up in the chain. And so in that sense, like just being itself, the very sort of nature of being and existence and structure and intelligibility, the sorts of features that you find in all being is inherently good. So when you're talking about existence, right, existence is a good. When you're talking about the intelligible properties that manifest within anything that exists, like just the basic properties of structure that are in a rock, you're talking about something that's good. And then also with them, you find the idea of these sort of ascending perfections, like you find in the great chain of being that we talked about last time. So I talked about the medieval term for this is perfection, right? A property you're greater if you have than if you lack. And so, plants are superior to rocks because they have life, and then animals are superior to plants, having some form of sentience and locomotion. And then rational beings like man is higher than, animals, and then angels being immortal or relatively immortal relative to us, right? Those are superior to us, and so on. And so you have this ascending chain of perfections, right? These vast goods, but everything within the chain is inherently good, right? That being itself is somehow a good. And when you're talking about evil, you're talking about some form of privation or twisting or corruption. And so the idea being that when you're talking about, say, something like sickness, right, you're talking about an absence of health, right? There is a divergence from proper formation. And this really was the idea that is going to be really important as we move forward. And the idea that on the one hand, being is good, but there's also a movement toward teleology, proper formation, health or wholeness. And the idea being that that's true in organism, just like your eye, right? The good of an eye is to be properly formed. And in being properly formed, it fulfills its telos, its purpose, its end, right? Which is to see. But it's also true in rational beings. You and I actually have a telos, right? There's a certain form, right? There's a certain proper formation of us in terms of virtue, in terms of morality, right? In terms of spirituality, in terms of ontology generally, that as we move towards, we're moving toward our good. Whereas when we diverge from that, we're moving into some form of corruption. And so the idea is that this is sort of par for the course with everything. So whether you're talking about, sickness, right? Some sort of, something has gone wrong in your eyes such that you can no longer see properly. It is a divergence from proper formation, right? It is a deprivation. Blindness is not an additive property, but a subtractive one. And so it is with virtue. And we talked about this, the idea that the sort of thing that you see in Plato that's then echoed in the Christians is the idea that the virtues are all sort of unified. They're all one. And so when you have lopsided virtues, you end up with a vice. So again, easy example being that if you have the sort of root of courage where it's like, I laugh in the face of danger, but you lack wisdom, you lack justice, and you lack temperance, then that becomes foolhardy, bullheaded, folly. And so now it's actually a vice. And so the idea being that the virtues themselves actually are something that are unified. You need all of them. And so it's the deprivation of a virtue that ends up getting you vice or wickedness. And just in general, I would just say that this is the sort of thing that we see across the board in terms of just our basic experience. The idea that every good good that we might approach, every good that we might name or desire, ultimately, it always requires struggle. And why, right? Why is it that it is harder to get jacked than it is to get, flimsy and, fat? Well, and the reason is because, to get jacked actually is a positive trait. It is something that you have to go after and acquire, right? It actually does involve things like discipline, like consistency, like effort and struggle in order to draw that potential for strength, that potential for wellness and wholeness and health into being, right? You actually have to sort of move uphill in the development toward the positive. Whereas the path of least resistance is always to just sort of retreat, right? To be sedentary or to sort of give into whatever the whims are that you would have to struggle against. So rolling downhill, as it were, is always easier than going uphill. And that's one of the things that you see across the board. So whether you're talking about the acquisition of a skill, like, learning to play music, or you're talking about the acquisition of wisdom or learning, through reading and study or life experience that knocks you around, or you're talking about temperance, learning this ability to restrain the passions or whatever it is, it's always that it is an uphill battle. Why? Because it is the acquisition of something positive, right? The opposite is actually just sort of letting the retreat away from being, right, take its toll, right? So the absence is always the easier path. Acquisition, to take on or acquire, pull into being, right, the thing that is positive and real, is always the more difficult task. And so that's true when you're talking about health, right? That it actually takes effort and a positive movement forward, right? Because it is the positive reality. It's true in the case of virtue. Now, one of the other things I also want to point out here, and this was something that really sort of stuck out. I can't believe I didn't mention it. Of course I can believe I didn't mention it. There's all sorts of things to mention in this sort of topic. What am I saying? But when I was talking about sort of the vast goodness of our world, there's always a tendency to sort of bristle and be like, yes, but, what about this atrocity? What about this horror? And do the sort of thing that Ivan Karamazov does in The Brothers Karamazov. So if you haven't read The Brothers Karamazov, there's sort of this classic speech from Ivan, who is the, sort of skeptic, in the group about this whole religion thing and about God and all this sort of stuff. And Ivan actually throws out this speech where he starts to talk about all these horrible things that, the Turks did to children, such as, murder and blowing their heads off and things like that. And there's something really visceral about that reality. And that's the thing that arrests people. And they go, yeah, the problem of evil is a very, very serious problem. How do you answer that sort of thing? But there's something else that I think is oftentimes missed about that. And it goes to this whole point about the idea that evil is a privation. The reason why seeing an infant murdered or imagining an infant murdered, the reason why that is so horrifying to us is actually because of the vast goodness of the infant, right? The greater the good of the thing, the more visceral it is when some sort of deprivation or corruption sets in. And so we might think of it this way, right? If I sit here and I do a little 2-second doodle and, it's not really, doesn't take a great deal of effort. It's not my best work, right? It might have more goodness to it than the average doodle because I'm actually a trained artist. I've cultivated that skill. So maybe it's better. But, the idea that you take it and you rip it up and toss it out, it really doesn't, strike you as this egregious sort of thing. But somebody walks up to Michelangelo's Pieta and decides to take a hatchet to it or take a sledgehammer to it and tries to destroy it. There is something incredibly visceral about that. Well, why? Because the unique goodness of that, the vast goodness of that makes the deprivation or the corruption of that all the more visceral. And something that I think something that we oftentimes miss is that the testimony to the goodness of our world is actually in that visceral reaction to evil. It's only because we know the sort of sweetness of love of a parent that when you encounter, say, abuse or something like that, that it strikes us as horrific because it's the thing that's being distorted, right? This vast, great good that's being distorted that hits us so palpably, right? With, when it is distorted or corrupted. It's because of the beauty and goodness of sexual intimacy that when that is violated, that there's something really visceral and jarring about that sort of thing. And so I think this is the sort of thing that is oftentimes missed, that so often we're fixated on the evil as if the evil is a substantive reality of its own, rather than realizing, like, no, the more visceral the evil, the greater the good there is that is attached to it, that it's attached to, right? That it is always parasitic. It's only because, children are a beautiful creation that the violation of children strikes us so horrifyingly with such horror. It's only because family is such a great good that when the family is broken apart in some way that it hits us so powerfully, right? It's only because love is something that is so beautiful and so healing and so is so part of the core of what we desire, that when it is shunned or destroyed or ripped from us or something like that, that it hits us so palpably. And so I think that's something that is important to recognize, because when we're dealing with evil, there really is a testimony there to sort of the nature of the goodness of the world, even though right now it might be overshadowed by some sort of scar or marring or twisting or distortion. And this is actually a point that C.S. Lewis makes, I forget where it is. It might be in Mere Christianity, where he talks about the idea that that the greater a good is, right, the greater a being is, the worse it is when it goes wrong, right? Its potential for goodness is actually in some ways proportionate to its potential for evil. And he talks about how a cow can't be very good or very bad, and maybe a dog. He likes dogs, I guess. Maybe a dog could be, sort of better or worse. A fool, better or worse still. An evil genius, better or worse still. And an archangel, best and worst of all. And obviously there he is introducing the idea that man has a greater capacity to perform goodness, to become a saint or become a villain than a cow. Right. The worst cow you might come up with isn't really that bad. Whereas a man, right, and specifically then he talks about the sort of hierarchy of the type of being that a man has. If a man has great genius, right, now all of a sudden his capacity for goodness and his capacity for evil, right, his capacity to be a saint or to be a villain is even has a greater polarity to it than the fool, right, who really isn't very good or bad at anything. And then very similarly, of course, he's hinting at the Christian narrative that the devil, right, the idea that the demons are these things that have an even greater polarity to them. And so when, your sort of angelic celestial overseers decide that they would rather destroy and corrupt and harm the sheep rather than take care of them, you've got a real problem. So there are two takeaways from this, right? The one is just the insistence that God is not the author of evil. God does not create evil because it's not a substance at all. He creates a world that is filled with being, a world that is filled with goodness. And the other thing, of course, is to suggest that when you encounter evil, because it is a twisting or a distortion, there's a certain proportionality. The greatest evils we encounter are so great precisely because they are corruptions of a very great good, right? There is a proportionality. The goodness of the being is in some ways proportional to the possible evil that might be perpetrated or might attach in the corruption of that sort of being. Now, of course, we've already here touched on and entered into the fringes of the free will defense. Now, in our first episode, we already talked about the sort of basics of the free will defense, which is to say that once you've introduced the idea of qualified omnipotence, right, the idea that God can't necessarily do whatever we might utter because we might be uttering something that is nonsense. This is what opens the door for the basics of the free will defense, which is to say that it is as nonsensical to talk about a square that is a circle or a square that does not have four sides as it is to talk about free beings that are determined by God. And why is this, right? The idea is that free will had always referred to in classical philosophical thinking, it referred to self-determination. I mean, I talked about how the Greek term for this really sort of means self-substancing, or out of the authority of one's own substance, basically. And amongst figures like, I think it's in Neoplatonism, that they tended to talk about the things that depend upon us. And that's a term that also echoes then in certain Christian writers as well. The idea that there is a certain part of the world that in the chain of being, that God has created these types of beings that are inherently rational. And with us being rational beings, we have this sort of unique capacity of self-awareness where we can look around and we can make an assessment for ourselves about the nature of the world, what we deem to be good, and in fact, even identify what God has deemed to be good. And then we can decide to do it or not do it. And that's really weird, right? Nothing else in all of creation does that. Bees don't sit around going, why do I have this stinger here? Well, that's interesting that I have it for that purpose. Do I want to use it for that purpose? Like, that's not a thing that happens with any other creatures. Whereas we actually have this really odd capacity to do this self-awareness that's able to sit here and contemplate what we are and contemplate the nature of the world and to discern the sort of structures that are there arising from the divine mind, including purpose, nature and purpose of things. And that includes self-reflection, like what is the nature of man and what is the purpose for which we're here? And then we can make decisions. We can decide to live in accord with these sort of structures of reality, or we can try to buck against it and choose our own way and, say to hell with the world, right? The way the world is, which a lot of people do actually choose to do, at least for a season. So that is sort of like the inherent nature of freedom. And so we had talked about the fact that very idea, right, the idea that there is this self-determining being means that there's something inherently contradictory in the idea that God creates self-determining beings whom he determines to do what he wants, right? That's as nonsensical as talking about like making squares that don't have four sides. And so in this sense, what is there, what you see in the church fathers and then the medieval scholastics and then after them in the free will defense, you see this idea that suggests that, yeah, what man is by nature, what an angel is by nature is a rational being, and that entails this sort of self-substancing, right, this self-authority. Now, I talked about there's one feature that I've critiqued before, actually, in print. I did an article on the Eastern Church Fathers and the free will defense, and I suppose we can link to that. But I did it for an Ashgate volume, and anyway, in that piece, I talked about how one of the flaws that I see in the sort of traditional free will defense, contemporary free will defense, is that oftentimes it ends up equating self-determination or freedom with the capacity to do good or evil. But of course, you have a real problem with this from the Christian perspective. Why? Because Christianity, unlike the pagans, actually did believe that God has free will. So this is actually something that's pretty unique in Judaism and Christianity. Among so many of the pagans, God is just sort of a metaphysical principle, right? It's not obvious that in any of the pagans that God chooses to make the world. Plato sort of talks kind of like God does, right? Like God desires to make all things as like him as possible. And he looks around and he finds these archetypes, and then he takes matter and he sort of like shapes it to sort of mirror that. And then he goes back to contemplating the forms and sort of lets us run and do our thing and, entrusts the world basically to rational beings like the gods and man. And so like Plato sort of has something that his narrative kind of sounds like maybe God makes a choice, but it's not obvious that he makes a choice. Aristotle certainly doesn't, Aristotle's God doesn't choose to make the world, right? It's just sort of an appendage where like matter just sort of moves and mutates and responds to the perfection of God. And then in Neoplatonism, it's not clear that God makes a choice to make the world. God in many ways seems to emanate, right, the world, as if it's just sort of this super overflow of being that sort of pours forth from God and begins to produce all the different creatures that, comprise the cosmos. So it's rather unique that in Judaism and Christianity, God is actually a person, right? He's actually a person who makes choices. And this actually raises a rather interesting conundrum for the free will defense, because on the one hand, Christianity is a big advocate, more so than anybody else, in the free will defense as an explanation for evil. I mean, Neoplatonists were advocates of free will as one explanation for evil, but the thing is, they also had the benefit of saying, well, but matter is inherently just unstable. It just can't sort of like perfectly approximate the forms that are in the mind of God, and therefore it's just kind of inevitable that these different corruptions set in. So they could blame matter and things like that, as well as blame, free will. But Christianity is the one that actually goes the full route of saying, look, everything God makes is good. And it really is solely because of free creatures that any sort of corruption enters our cosmos. And so that's really the sort of strongest advocacy. It lays more at the feet of free will than any other of the ancient systems of thought, any of the other pagan philosophies. And so on the one hand, it's clearly, an advocate of free will and of the free will defense. But the irony is that it also creates this interesting conundrum, because it wants to say, unlike the pagans, that God has free will, but God can't perform evil. And so you run into this sort of problem that's there, because if you're going to say that God has free will, he actually does have a choice about whether or not to make the world and what sort of world to make and what to do in terms of his interactions with creatures. If you're going to advocate all of that, as Judaism and Christianity does, then you actually have to say that free will does not entail, at least not necessarily, it doesn't entail the possibility of evil. So why then say God can't, why not have God create creatures that are just like him, right? Why doesn't he create creatures who have free will, self-determination, but just like him, that self-determination might only do good, right? It would never contemplate or consider the introduction of evil. Well, believe it or not, there actually is a good answer to this question. And it has to do with the very difference that you see, the metaphysical difference between God and creatures that is fleshed out within the Eastern Church Fathers. So the point becomes really clear within the Arian Dispute. So the Arian Dispute is really sort of the first major ecumenical dispute. And what I mean by this is in early Christianity was divided regionally, East and West, linguistically, Latin, Greek, and other languages. It had various bishops or popes that represented sort of different centers of power or governance over the church, the hierarchy of the church. But there was still unity to it, right? The church was one church. And so there were certain occasions in which a certain controversy would break out, and there was a need to sort of gather the entire church, the authorities of the church, the representatives of the church, in order to determine, normally what they were determining was, what did we receive, right? The question was, it was never actually a question of saying, well, that's an interesting problem, how might we solve it? It was more of a question of, what is the faith that we received? But the point is that really sort of they're looking at these questions, and there's some sort of dispute, like in the case of the Arian Dispute. Arius of Alexandria is saying, the Son of God, right, the second person of the Trinity, he is a creature, right? He's a very godlike creature, very high in the chain, maybe the highest in the chain, most godlike creature, let's say. But he's not God, right? He is created. And then somebody like Athanasius of Alexandria is saying that's not true, right? He is God, right? He's of the same nature as the Father, right? He has the same nature. He is begotten of the Father. And just like when I beget a son, he is human, right? Just like me. So if God begets a son, he is divine, like God. And so they're of the same nature. So he too is God. And the church basically had to look at this and say, okay, which one is the faith that was handed down to us? And so they really saw themselves as curators, right? We are protectors, we are keepers of what has been handed down. That's what the term tradition, paradosis, means. that which is handed down. And so they're in these ecumenical disputes, they're asking, well, what is the faith that we received, right? We've got two different reports going on here. Which one is correct? And so the Arian dispute is really sort of the most, probably the most well-known of these, because it was the first of these. And it led to the Council of Nicaea, held in 325 AD. And that gives rise to the first draft of the Nicene Creed. It was expanded at Constantinople in 381. And that's the one the churches say today, minus the filioque. And so that is really the sort of most well-known, probably, of all of the early ecumenical disputes, the dispute between Arius of Alexandria and Athanasius of Alexandria, which ultimately led to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Now, because this dispute actually had to do with the question of, is the Son of God a creature or not, you actually ended up getting a very clear sense of how the early church understood the nature of creatureliness. I dare say the metaphysics of creatureliness. And so this dispute actually is incredibly helpful in fleshing out, well, when they talk about the difference between God and creatures, what is it that differentiates God and creatures? And this really does, sort of make its way into sharp relief within this dispute. Actually, there's another article I should probably recommend if you're interested in this. I actually do have an article called On the Metaphysics of God and Creatures in the Eastern Church Fathers. And the entire article is just sort of fleshing out what they have to say about the traits of creatureliness. And then the second half of the article, the traits by contrast of divinity. But for our purposes, one of the things that's really clear is that it makes apparent, this dispute makes apparent, that what a creature is, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, is something that comes into being, okay? Something that moves from non-being into being, or from potential to reality, something that becomes concretely real. Now, there is a whole set of basically underlying metaphysics or physics here that is presumed within this. So the concept here is actually the belief that when you're talking about a possible being, let's say, God, before creating anything in particular, he thinks of a possible being that he wishes to create. Let's call him man, right? This sort of bipedal, 10-fingered, 10-toed, 2-eyed, rational animal. Well, that is a possible being, meaning there is no inherent contradiction in the idea of it. It is within God's power to create it, and it is within the, sort of possibilities of matter to receive those sorts of properties. And so there you have sort of the boundary lines of possibility. But the thing is, the idea is that possible thing needs to move from a mere possibility, a mere potentiality, into a concrete reality. And this is where the concept, really sort of what emerges here, is the presumption of hylomorphic metaphysics. So hylomorphic metaphysics is the sort of thing that folks who have heard of it, they've either heard of it associated with Aristotle, because it's central to Aristotle's understanding of physics and of substance and things like that. It's also then, other folks might know it from Thomas Aquinas, who Thomas Aquinas got it from Aristotle. But it's, they're far from the only two who have ever advocated hylomorphic metaphysics. And the term is just from like huli, which is like matter, and morphe, which is, form. And so it's suggesting that anything that exists is a form matter composite. And so the term form really just refers to the structures of things. So for anyone who's heard me talk about realism, which is basically anybody who's ever listened to this podcast, where I've talked about how realism is based on the idea that when we look out into the world, what we see is we see all of these structures. We see genera, animal, species, human, we see common properties, bipedal, 10-fingered, whatever it is. And these sorts of structures, the question of realism is the question of, are those structures part of, are those features of reality that are somehow just out there as part of the structure of the real? Or are they inventions of the mind? And realism, which Christianity has always been realist, but realism holds that these things are in some ways features of reality. They're not mental fictions. We're not just projecting this out there. The mind is actually abstracting or identifying structural properties of reality. And when you're talking about form, right, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about those sort of structural features of being, those structural features of reality. Now, Plato thought that those structures were, actual substances. He believed in a second world, right, our world, or at least if you're advocating the traditional reading in Plato. There's some questions of whether this is totally accurate, but for our purposes, Plato believed that, sort of matter is a material replica or a shadow, right? A replica of some other second world of archetypal ideas, of forms, of structures. And I've talked about that in other episodes. So whereas Aristotle thought that form is actually like in the substance, it's in the thing. And this sort of thing that is illustrated in Raphael's painting, The School of Athens, which for those on YouTube, you can see it up here in the corner. And so in the center of this painting, what you see Plato and Aristotle. And Plato is pointing up, right? And he's saying the forms, right? And Aristotle is extending his hand out, right? Saying the forms. In other words, Aristotle thinks the forms are out there, right? It's actually in the substance of the things. It's present in you and me. Whereas Plato's like, no, the forms are a second world, right? They're off in this second world. Or in the Neoplatonists, they're in the mind of God. But with hylomorphic metaphysics, that's reflective of Aristotle's view that form, those structures, are somehow in matter. And so what Aristotle suggests that everything is composed of is basically matter and form. Now, what Aristotle means by matter is he doesn't mean atoms and particles, he doesn't mean protons or electrons or anything like that. What he means when he talks about matter is really sort of this baseline underlying substratum of pure potential, meaning like what matter is just the potential. It's a substratum, right, beneath things. It is a underlying amorphous, meaning it has no form, potential to be a thing. And so one of the ways in which I sometimes illustrate this is I'll use like a bit of fabric, right? Now, the problem, of course, is that fabric has more structure than Aristotle's concept of matter is, right? Like this particular fabric that I'm holding right now, it's a towel. It's blue, and, it has density and other sort of structural traits. But for our purposes, it'll help illustrate the point. This fabric is, in a certain sense, structureless. It can take on any number of shapes. And so, for example, if I were to take an object, here we have a cylinder, and I were to drape it around that, right? Drape this fabric around it. Well, voila, right? The fabric has taken on the shape of a cylinder. It has become cylindrical, right? That sort of thing. And what Aristotle wants to point out is suggests that matter is not inherently cylindrical, evident in the fact that it does take on, sort of traits or properties that are not cylindrical. But it is also the potential to be cylindrical, right? It's this underlying potential to be any number of things. And what he suggests is that when it becomes that, right, the intelligible structures that manifest within form are not form itself. Those are what we refer to as matter, right? Those are the intelligible traits that exist in the mind of God. They're the intelligible traits that we abstract, right? Those intelligible traits, right, the structures of being, are the things that manifest within matter. And so Aristotle wants to suggest that any object that you might encounter is actually a combination. It's a pairing of matter, right, a substratum of potential to be a thing, paired with actual structures, actual intelligible structures, be it cylindricality or, feline or humanity or tree or whatever it might be. And so that's the concept of hylomorphic metaphysics. Now, the relevance to the Eastern Church Fathers is that they actually do understand, since you're talking about creatures, what you're talking about is a possible being, a being that did not exist, but the idea of which certainly represented an intelligible possibility, and then that being somehow manifest in reality, concretely. Now, the question is, how does the manifestation within reality occur? Well, the answer was through matter, right? The idea that some sort of substratum of potential, right, the potential to be a concrete thing, receive those properties, giving rise to the concrete manifestation of that thing. So every creature, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, actually is hylomorphic. So you and I are a combination of an underlying potential, evident in the fact that we still have potential to change and either grow or retreat and be corrupted or, shift in all sorts of ways that are sort of baseline neutral, like change color or something like that. But the idea is that we are sort of a bundle of potentiality paired with concrete realities, right? Actual formal properties. And that's what you're talking about whenever you're talking about a creature. And incidentally, if you're wondering, well, wouldn't that mean that angels are actually like material? And their answer is yeah. Yeah, angels are material. So you can actually see an article I did on this, on whether or not the soul and angels are material according to the Eastern Church Fathers. And I actually lay out the case why they think that. Incidentally, that's not entirely unique to the Eastern Church Fathers. Aquinas certainly doesn't believe that, but Bonaventure does. Anyway, I walked through the sort of various evolution of that perspective, right, of that idea throughout, the East as contrasted with the West in that article. So you can see that there. But the answer is yeah. Angels did not exist, and then they were created, which means they moved from non-being into being, meaning they moved from a pure potentiality into a concrete reality. And that means that they are a hylomorphic entity. They are a combination of the potential to be paired with concrete realities, and they have the potential to shift and change and be other than they are, which is why they were corruptible. Now that right there, that last point, that gets us to the very answer that you can find in terms of the Eastern Church Fathers for how you would address the question of saying, well, if free will, can exist in God, and it doesn't entail the possibility of evil, then how come in creatures it entails the possibility of evil? And here we actually get the answer. So I talked about the fact that hylomorphic metaphysics actually marks the divide between a creature and God. So when you're talking about a creature, you are talking about something that undergoes process, right? You're talking about being that moves into reality, and for that reason is changeable and corruptible. Well, why? Because the very start to our existence, and this is the sort of thing that comes out so clearly in the Arian Dispute, the point is that every creature's existence begins with a movement into being, which is a change or a mutation, you becoming something you previously were not. And so this becomes the mark or the trait of creatureliness. Creatureliness is marked by mutability or changeability, the ability to be otherwise. Now, this also introduces the concept that that change is not always good. Right? So we talked about what evil is. And we talked about evil, yes, in the moral sense that you can diverge, but we also talked about the evil of an eye, right? That this is what's called physical evil, the idea that blindness or some sort of sickness might set in, a divergence from health. So the thing is that possibility, that mutation, right? The fact that you move into being and move toward wholeness and health also entails the possibility of retreating from that back to non-being. In other words, because you are a bundle of formal properties and potentiality or possibility, that underlying potentiality carries with it the possibility of that same form that it received retreating. Why? Because none of the properties that matter receives are native to it. None of them are innate to it. And so anything that it can receive, it can also release. That same potentiality that gives rise to the possibility of a man coming into existence is also what gives rise to the possibility of the man ceasing to exist. So anything it can receive, it can also release. Any property it can receive, it can also release, which means that every creature is subject to both generation, the moving into being, and also corruption, the retreat from being. And that underlying possibility means that you also have with it the possibility of physical evil, meaning some sort of corruption or divergence from proper formation, right? Sickness, something like that. But it also then carries with it the possibility of moral corruption. So keep in mind, what did we say about rational beings? Well, we said rational beings by our very nature are beings who have this sort of innate self-awareness, the ability to assess the world and the good, and to make a choice, a self-determination, a self-substancing, whether or not to move in accord with it or diverge from it. And what this also means is that every moral creature also carries within our person, right, the possibility for moral corruptions. Because keep in mind what I said, right? What is the nature of a rational being? Well, we carry with us, within our very person, within our ontology, as a central trait, this sort of self-awareness, this ability to look out and assess the good and make self-determining choices, right? To self-determine toward the good or to retreat from the good. And so for that reason, we not only carry within our person that underlying potential doesn't just mark the possibility of physical corruption, but also of moral corruption. Now, this also sort of wades into two other points that are really important. The one is just it marks the contrast with God. God is not a being of process, right? God is not a being that moves into being. God is not a being that needs to become what he is. Rather, unlike creatures, God is fully what he is. And for that reason, there is no potentiality for divergence into what we would call corruption. Because keep in mind, that's what all of this is. Whenever we're talking about an eye that might be malformed, we're talking about an entity, right? This organ that could and should sort of move toward proper formation, and in attaining its proper formation, attain its proper end or telos, right? That it might attain its proper function. But the fact that it has that underlying potentiality means that it can be malformed, or it can be properly formed for a season and then diverge from it. And so in the same way with moral creatures, that underlying potential means that we have to move into our moral formation, but we can also diverge from it. We can fail to move into that, or we might be able to retreat from that. Whereas the contrast is, this is not the nature of God. God is not a hylomorphic entity. And this is one of the reasons why you'll hear me say sometimes, I'm like, well, angels are immaterial. Well, I mean, relatively immaterial. That caveat is always there because angels are hylomorphic, right? So they are, and this is the sort of thing you find, in the church fathers, people like John of Damascus says it explicitly, that angels are immaterial relative to flesh, meaning they're highly ethereal, but relative to God, all things are gross or thick and material. That's what John of Damascus says. And so the idea is that unlike you and me, where we are these sort of hylomorphic composites, where we can move into our proper formation and diverge from it, God is not that. God actually is fully what he is. And for that reason, all that he does, all that he is, all that he chooses is reflective of proper formation. So for you and I, if we were properly formed spiritually and morally, we actually would be virtuous, right? It's not just random, right? This is the importance of identifying evil as a privation. When we're talking about wickedness, we're actually talking about something privative. We're talking about malformation. We're talking about us not yet being fully what we are made to be. Whereas God is not a being of process. So he doesn't move toward or become good. He doesn't move toward or become just. He doesn't move toward or become wise. He is those things already. And for that reason, all of his activities, all of his acts are ultimately expressions of what he is already. And therefore, there is no possibility of a malformation or a divergence or a corruption or something like that. He doesn't have that same sort of composition that we have. So that underlying metaphysical difference between you and me and God, on the other hand, or any other creature, and God, on the other hand, is the thing that underwrites the free will defense. The reason God's free will does not entail the possibility of evil is because God's not being formed into anything. He's not self-substancing the way you and I are. He's not becoming what he is made to be. He is what he is, right? He already is just, wise, and good, and all of those sorts of things. So all of his activities, all of his free choices express what he is already. Whereas you and I, our free choices are actually aimed at moving toward and becoming what we are made to be. And that underlying becoming, being wed with potentiality, carries with it the possibility of retreat into corruption and evil. This is actually one of the things that comes out over and over and over again in the Arian dispute, as I mentioned, because basically what everybody's telling Arius is, if your Son of God is a creature, then he is necessarily mutable, he's necessarily turnable, meaning you can turn away from the good, he's necessarily corruptible, at least morally, spiritually, maybe physically. If he's made out of matter, he would be made out of matter, all of these sorts of things. So that's where all of this comes out in the Arian dispute. Now, a careful listener might actually notice a potential problem. This raises the question, if what a creature is a being that is inherently susceptible to change and retreat from goodness, right, from proper formation, then does that mean that the threat of sin and corruption sort of always hangs over creation? Thus, even after the final judgment and the restoration of all things, we might once again tear down the world and drag it into evil. Incidentally, that actually is a question that the Eastern Church Fathers are attuned to, because they are aware of that ramification. And we're going to get back to that question soon enough in the context of the broader narrative. But for now, the point is simply to explain why, in the case of God, free will does not entail the possibility of evil, whereas in creatures it does. Now, this naturally brings us to the permissive will of God. Once again, we've already talked about this topic, but I think the Eastern Fathers offer some really interesting additions here. So we've already actually touched on one of these in episode 2, because I talked about the antecedent and consequent will of God. Now, I credited that to Leibniz because Leibniz, most folks who know that distinction, or a lot of the folks who know that distinction, know it because of Leibniz. And they think of it as a Leibnizian distinction. It's distinction between God's antecedent will and his consequent will. But Leibniz himself gets that distinction from John of Damascus, the Eastern Church Father. And he's well aware of that. And he even points out and grants that the concept, even though the terms antecedent and consequent will come from John of Damascus, he points out that the concept actually originates in the Eastern Church Fathers long before John of Damascus. And he points that, for example, John Chrysostom's homilies on Ephesians, you can find the concept, even though the terms aren't there yet. So what is this distinction? And the distinction is basically the idea that when we talk about whether or not God wills any good, or repels any evil, we can actually say, if we're talking about considered in itself, we can say that God wills every good, no matter what it is, right, proportionate to its goodness, and any evil we might name, right, as a corruption or a deprivation, proportionate to its lack of goodness, he repels and wills not. But the problem is, of course, that our world is complex, and it creates these sort of entanglements where there are certain goods that God wills that end up carrying with them the possibility of evil. And free will is obviously, it's the most obvious one of these, right? So if you want beings that are extremely godlike, then this carries with it the possibility that they diverge from the good, because that's inherent in the nature of created free beings. And you'll notice that I included created for the reasons that we just talked about. That once you're talking about what a creature is, that carries with it the possibility of corruption. So to make creatures is to make something that is inherently corruptible. And then when you pair creatureliness with self-determination, now you have the possibility of moral corruption. And so the fact of the matter is, does God will for us to do evil or to bring about horrors in the world or something like that? And the answer is no. God repels every one of those far more than you or I do. But the fact of the matter is that it's a metaphysical entanglement, right? That once you start to make creatures, you're talking about something that's corruptible. Once you start talking about free rational beings, you're talking about something that is self-determining and therefore subject to moral and spiritual corruptions. And so there is no way to make a world full of free rational beings without creating a world that opens the door to those types of corruptions. Now, we already talked about all of that in episode 2. But there's an interesting feature that emerges here when talking about the goodness of God and providence. And actually, there's a number of very interesting insights from the Eastern Fathers about providence generally. So let's start with the first one that emerges just when considering the antecedent will of God. So when talking about the goodness of God, sometimes people have a very sort of vague sense of what divine goodness means. Some people want to just say, like, whatever God does would be good. And this is sort of a weird thing because it indicates that, it's not really clear that that even means that God is good. So this is sort of like this odd genuflecting, right? Like where it's like, well, doesn't matter what God does. If God wants to torture infants for fun, then torturing infants for fun is good because God does it. This is actually what raises what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma. So in the Euthyphro dialogue, Socrates, who's on his way to trial, he ends up meeting someone named Euthyphro. And Socrates is on trial. He's on his way to trial because he's corrupted the youth, right? Because of his disposition toward the gods versus, the supreme God that he's come to, the conclusion of the good and all that. But when he encounters Euthyphro is on his way to testify at his father's trial, who is on trial for murder, right? For killing a slave. And Socrates is like, oh, yeah, so you must be going there in order to testify on his behalf, right, to defend your father. And he's like, oh, no, I'm going there to testify against him. And Socrates is shocked. He's like, you don't feel any conflict about, sort of your innate duties to your father or some sort of loyalty to him versus sort of this role of testimony in the courts or something like that. There's no internal conflict that emerges there for you, Euthyphro? And Euthyphro is like, no, man, I totally get it. I see the good clear as day. And Socrates is just sort of flabbergasted. He's just like, well, if you see the good that clearly, I really need to become your student, sit at your feet. So tell me, Euthyphro, right? How have you discerned, right, the good so clearly? And Euthyphro, of course, suggests, well, you just do as the gods do. And this is terribly unsatisfactory as far as Socrates is concerned, because in a polytheistic context like this, he's like, well, which gods? And then as the dialogue persists and Socrates presses him further and further and further, you get to the Euthyphro dilemma, which is basically saying, is the good because God does it? And that's that kind of genuflecting thing that I mentioned there. Doesn't matter what God does, whatever he does, it's good because he did it. Or does God do this thing, right? Does God do the good because it's good? In other words, there's some sort of innate ontology to it that makes it good. And therefore, that's why God is doing it. And Socrates doesn't actually answer this question. Euthyphro is like, look, man, I got things to do. So great question, but I'm moving on to go have my dad tried for murder. So the Christian position, the traditional Christian position on this has never actually been that whatever God does, it's good, right? As if the good is arbitrarily determined by God. That's never been the Christian view. And candidly, I don't think that view is even intelligible, because really in that sense, it isn't really meaningful to say that God is good. Because now what you're just saying is that God is God. So, we sort of bow and say, you did great, no matter what you did. It's almost, there's like the Simpsons Halloween episode, which is modeled after the Twilight Zone episode, where you have the kid who like has these mind powers and everybody's afraid to like think bad thoughts about him. And they all try to be happy and say great things about him because he might just like destroy them at any second. And that's kind of the God you get in this scenario, where it's like, well, when we say he's good, we're just sort of like giving hollow praise to him because he's so powerful, that, we just are sort of bound to praise whatever he does. But there's no real substance of saying that God is good. It just means that God is God. And so we're just sort of stuck with whatever he does. The more traditional Christian view has been a couple of things. Like the one is, it should be sort of obvious already from what we've said about privation, the idea that being itself has an inherent goodness to it. So when we're talking about relative goods, we're talking about goods relative to the nature of the thing. So the good of an eye is to see. And that has to do with a good that's grounded in its nature. But the idea is that, and then, the good of the stomach, to digest, and the good of, leaves for photosynthesis, whatever, right? Like all these things are relative goods. And this goes to a point that I had mentioned in also, I think it was in episode 2, where I talked about the great chain of being and the idea that every good, right, that good is somehow a transcendental. It transcends all these things, but it articulates itself. God articulates himself in all of these various goods. And so when we talk about goodness, right, goodness manifests in all sorts of different ways. It refracts through all of these sort of finite creatures, right? It manifests in the forms of pleasure. It manifests in the forms of love, right? It manifests in all sorts of different ways, and yet there is this sort of commonality to it. But it can't be boiled down to a single property like linear or four-sided or redness or something like that. And so the presumption here, and this is the sort of thing you find in Plato, and it's the sort of thing that you find in the Christians, is that above this, right, transcending all of this, is goodness itself, which is God. And so what we're talking about was when we're talking about the good, when we're talking about that infinite, boundless, transcendental, right, that infinite goodness that then becomes finitely articulated in all the various goods of the world, what we're really talking about is the idea that God is the good. And therefore, then when he begins to articulate or express himself in the production of a world, right, when he creates the chain of being and he's sort of refracting that goodness out in all of these different things, what you're getting is various cascading ontological goods. And for each of those, the idea is that what you find is that goodness is ultimately ontological. Now, the importance in this context is to say that when you're talking about the good of a thing, you're not talking about something that's arbitrary, and you're not talking about something that's terribly abstract. You're talking about something that's pretty concrete, When you're talking about the good of an eye, you are talking about it being properly formed. You are talking about it being formed in such a way that it reaches its innate telos, right? Its end, right? Such that it can see. The ear for hearing and all of those sorts of things. And that's one of the reasons why when we start to talk about the good of a being, we're talking about something that has to do with its innate structure, that sort of relative goodness, the goodness of the thing. Now, the reason that's important is because teleology is pervasive in all things, right? Notice that whenever scientists encounter, like they dig up some dinosaur or something like that, they begin to ask questions about like, well, why? Why is it the way that it is? I noticed this, like my kids, when they were little, they watched a show called Dinosaur Train. And I think I've mentioned this before in another podcast, but in Dinosaur Train, there was always paleontologist Steve. And, you know, at the end of the day, what would happen is you'd finish the episode and you've met a new dinosaur, right? And paleontologist Steve comes out and goes, "Hey, kids, today on Dinosaur Train, we met the whatever-saurus. And you might have noticed that this dinosaur had this strange feature to it, you know, like it's got a bone that protrudes from its head. And you might wonder, why does it have that?" And what I found interesting is that paleontologist Steve never said, well, the reason that it has that, well, there is no reason, because there's no reason for anything, because everything's just random mutation that is purposeless and unguided. And therefore, that mutation that protrudes from its head is really just an ugly appendage that has no point. And life is meaningless, kids, and you should just kill yourselves. Like, paleontologist Steve never said that, right? He always offered some kind of explanation. Well, we think it's hollow, and therefore, because it's sort of like ties to its nasal cavity, we actually think it may have been the sort of thing that they could make noise through, and therefore they could communicate with one another or something like that. Whenever you look at the order of nature, you end up asking basic questions of why is it this way? And what's interesting about nature is it always offers an answer that's sort of innate to the teleology, an innate telos, right? An answer that is somehow woven into the nature of the thing. And so the idea is that there is not only formal properties, structures everywhere, but those structures indicate telos. They indicate purpose or ends. Now, why have I gone down this road? There's very good reason, because in Christianity, when talking about the goodness of providence, in the Eastern Church Fathers, when they talk about God's goodness in a providential context, his care for creation, it's very specific. What it means is that God wills the good of a creature. And that is not some vague utilitarian sentiment about all of us, you know, having maximized pleasure or something like that. What it's talking about is that when God orders the world, innate to that order is that everything has a purpose or an end, a proper form that carries with it a proper function or purpose or end. And what God, being good, wills is that every single creature is properly formed and fulfills its proper end. That's what it means to say that God is good, to say that providence is good. And in fact, the Eastern Church Fathers suggest that not only is that true of God, it's impossible that God, being the good, could will otherwise. That's always what he wills. And this is one of the reasons why, when it comes to man, for example, the Eastern Church Fathers are so insistent that God wills all to be saved, right? He wills that you and I come to the knowledge of the truth, which is obviously something they're taking from St. Paul, but why they take it so seriously. Like, why can you be confident in that? Well, because for you to be saved, for you to become spiritually formed, right, virtuous, to partake of the divine nature, to attain to the happiness that comes from knowing and being united with God, is your proper end. And God, being good, can will none other than your proper end. This is also why they understand, you know, when Ezekiel says, or God says to Ezekiel, that he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, why they take that so seriously. And this is also one of the reasons why they insist that they have very clear insistence on how you're supposed to read certain biblical texts. So one of the ones that I'm sure folks who have listened to me regularly have heard me talk about is the story of Moses and Pharaoh. And anybody who's read the book of Exodus has read about God talking about how he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And this is troubling to a lot of people because on the surface, it sounds like, is God saying that he's going to make Pharaoh be resistant and stubborn, and then he's going to punish Pharaoh for being stubborn? And obviously that troubles people because it seems to be prima facie unjust. And it actually is, right? We've talked about that the conditions of moral culpability are that you know what you ought to do and you have the ability to do it and not do it. So if Pharaoh has no ability to not resist God, then it would plainly be unjust to hold him culpable for resisting God. He doesn't have a choice in the matter. But that's not how the Eastern Church Fathers read it. In fact, what's interesting is that in, I believe it's in Origins on Prayer, where he talks about this, and then that passage is picked up and included in the approved text of Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus from Origen. He talks about the idea, he raises that question of, is this what the text is saying, right? He's talking specifically about Paul's echo of this in Romans 9. And then he's like, well, that would obviously be unjust, so it's false. Like the Eastern Church Fathers will not entertain the idea that there is an authentic injustice in God because they're so convinced of the goodness of divine providence that that's impossible. And that's one of the reasons why how they actually do read the text is they point out, for example, as I've pointed out on their behalf here many times, that in the story of Moses and Pharaoh, God treats Moses and Pharaoh identically. He shows up, he declares who he is, demonstrates it by miracle, and makes a demand. And in the case of Moses, he repents, right? In the case of Pharaoh, he hardens and cracks. And that's actually exactly how the Eastern Fathers read it. They use, well, Origen uses the example of the sun, right? If the sun, S-U-N, could talk, it could say, well, I caused to grow and flourish, and I caused to wither and crack. But it wouldn't be saying that it's treating different soils differently. Instead, it's identifying a difference in the soil itself. And this is what they see in this story. God is not saying, well, I'm going to make Pharaoh be disobedient and then punish him for being disobedient. Instead, what he's saying is, I know this man. He thinks he's a god. And when I show up and I declare who I am, he is going to harden and he's going to crack and he's going to resist and dig in his heels, right? In other words, what hardens Pharaoh's heart is God speaking to him. What hardens Pharaoh's heart is that God is going to show up and unveil himself, and that's going to be the result. And that's what they suggest. That's the proper way of reading that sort of passage. And Gregory of Nyssa points out the same sort of thing. There's an entire thing, I think it's in his homilies on the Lord's Prayer, where he talks about this, and he goes through how you should read Old Testament passages. For example, whenever the Old Testament talks about God, sort of like, it sounds like he is, bloodthirsty or wanting to strike down the wicked and make sure that they are no more, that sort of thing. Gregory of Nyssa suggests that it's actually rather blasphemous and inappropriate to ascribe to God some sort of passion, right? God is not an animal, so he doesn't have animal passions the way we have. But also what Gregory points out is what we know about providence, that God desires the good of the creature, and this includes the wicked. And so how Gregory suggests that we should always read these sorts of declarations is that if the wicked were to repent, they would no longer be wicked. In other words, if everyone repented, you would look around and the wicked would be no more, and their place would remember them no more. This is how Gregory suggests that you're supposed to understand it, that these sorts of passages you're supposed to read in the light of divine providence, in the light of what we know about God's goodness and his desire for all to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth, and the fact that he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. This actually raises, just because somebody in the comments, I believe, mentioned Isaiah 45, where there's this talk about whether God creates evil, and that was sort of raised as a possible objection, biblical objection, to the idea that evil is a privation as opposed to a substance. Now, of course, the Eastern Church Fathers advocate using the Septuagint, and I'm not going to go into all the reasons why, but we'll just grant for a moment that they do advocate using the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, the meaning of this passage is much clearer because it talks about God creating light and then shaping the darkness. And then it also talks about, rather than good and evil, it talks about God creating or crafting peace but then also producing basically conflict or turmoil or something like that. So the contrast with peace ends up making clear what precisely this evil is, right? It's in contrast with sort of turmoil or trial or some sort of conflict, disharmony, that sort of thing. Now, that might sound impossible given what we had actually just talked about, right? If God is providential, if God's providence is such that he wills the good of the creature, then surely he couldn't ever send trials or induce pain or calamity or something like that. Well, not so. So the way the Eastern Fathers understand this, however, is that it is always purposive. Purposive? Right, there it is. That was weird how it came out of my mouth. It's always purposive. So in other words, he doesn't inflict pain for the sake of pain. He doesn't send trials for the sake of trials. Rather, the idea is, as they understand it, like Origen, again, using this him as an example, he uses the analogy of a doctor, right? The physician may cause harm to a body, cutting it open, removing things, whatever it might be. But he does it for a purpose. It's not in order to kill the body. Rather, it's in order to heal the body. It's in order to address some sort of infirmity. In other words, yes, when it comes to like caring for the body, to cut it open is actually not a good, right? That is an evil to the body. But if you are in a scenario where there is some sort of illness that has taken hold, and to leave the body whole, right, to leave it untouched, is to leave it in a position where the sickness will spread and it will die, then you are in a position where the cutting open of the body and the tending to, let's say, the cancer is the sort of thing that is necessary for the overall health of the body. In other words, the convergence between, good and evil here is such that even though, cutting open the body is an evil to the body, something you would not actually will in itself if you were interested in the good of the body, because of the cancerous nature of the body, this becomes in some ways a necessary evil, necessary for the overall health and restoration of the body. This is what in medieval ethics is referred to as the doctrine of double effect, where good and evil are entangled in such a way that even though this is an evil that you would not typically do, in this circumstance, it is sort of a necessary evil that actually is the right course of action. And that's really how the Eastern Church Fathers understand the nature of divine choice. When I was talking about in the previous episode, in episode 2, where I said that Leibniz is insistent that God is not a utilitarian, right? He doesn't just sort of like say, well, I can do whatever evils I want as long as it has some sort of grand outcome that I really like. That's not what Leibniz means. This is exactly the point, because this is exactly where the Eastern Fathers do not suggest that God ever just sort of perpetrates evil for evil's sake, nor does he even just sort of perpetrate an evil because he thinks it might have sort of a nice outcome on the other side. Rather, it's only in these sort of complex entanglements between good and evil that God does, in fact, inflict some sort of violence or evil upon a person or a nation or whatever it might be. Let's use two sort of examples. And these examples are rather interesting in terms of the Eastern Church Fathers. So let's talk about the flood, for example. This is going to touch on an important feature of of the overall narrative that we're going to get to in terms of the Eastern Church Fathers. So oftentimes when we talk about sort of death and we talk about this narrative and what transpires in a person's story, there is a tendency to end the storyline when they die. And I mean, I suppose in Latin Western sort of Christian traditions, there's a tendency to, of course, we'll talk about heaven or hell or something like that. But for the Eastern Church Fathers, there is something that's much more fluid happening. The idea that those who die actually enter Hades. They enter the realm of the dead. In other words, the moment your soul leaves your body, you are dead and you are in the realm of the dead, right? Wherever dead people go. And now the reason this is important is because this goes to this sort of long view of the story, and it contextualizes in some ways some of these more, let's say, violent acts of God. So it is a doctrine in the Eastern Church Fathers. It is a doctrine in the Christian East that Christ descended into Hades, that he, at his own death, entered the realm of the dead, and he went and he, well, according to Peter, in one of his letters, he preached to those who rebelled in the days of Noah. Now, how this is interpreted by somebody like Maximus the Confessor is rather interesting, because Maximus, on the one hand, does advocate what the Eastern tradition, right? The Eastern Christianity has always advocated, which is that Christ on Holy Saturday, between Good Friday and the resurrection or Pascha, that he actually did descend into Hades. He entered the realm of the dead because he died, right? And with that, of course, Peter talks about him preaching to those who rebelled in the days of Noah. Now, there's something else that Peter actually says in this passage, which is oftentimes missed. Like, people are familiar with that part of what Peter says, but he actually says something along the lines of they were punished in the flesh as men in order that they might live by the Spirit. And the way Maximus the Confessor reads that is he actually suggests that they were drowned specifically as an act of punishment or judgment, but that act of judgment, the rebels in the days of Noah were drowned specifically for a redemptive end, that they might live. In other words, what Maximus sees in this picture is that you have rebels that have gone so far into moral and spiritual corruption that God says, every thought and intent of their heart is wicked from birth, and I have to wipe clean the slate, right? I'm going to drown all of them except for this righteous remnant, and we're going to start over. That's how wicked and bad they are. They're so far beyond repentance and redemption that that's where they're at. But that doesn't mark the end of their story. Instead, what happens is when they are drowned, when they die, their souls are ripped out of their bodies, and they are cast into darkness, into the darkness of Hades, into the darkness of the realm of the dead. And with that, what that means is they actually no longer have bodies by which to exercise evil. And also with that, this becomes in some ways sort of a forced rehabilitation, like a heroin addict who is suddenly like forced into rehab and strapped down, and he detoxes. And even though he wants heroin, he can't get heroin. In other words, that sort of extreme measure of ripping them out of their bodies, ending their existence in the flesh, is purposive. And it's purposive that by ripping them out of their flesh and putting them into the darkness of Hades and making it impossible for them to act on their passions and giving them that time to sit in that darkness until Christ appears and preaches to them, preaches to those rebels, has a purpose, namely to bring about their redemption. Okay, now this is one of the things that's rather interesting about the Eastern Fathers, and we're starting to touch into the sort of longer narrative. But again, you see this also. My point here is actually we're not to the longer narrative. You're starting to get glimpses of it already. But the purpose here is actually to highlight the very fact that that very sort of dark, painful surgery to remove the cancer is how they see this. And this is something you see all throughout the Old Testament. Oftentimes there's this, not only does God declare that he doesn't take pleasure in the death of the wicked, but oftentimes he refuses to punish certain people in a definitive way because their sins are not yet fully ripened. Now, the cynical way of reading that is to say, well, see, God's just sitting there going like, I really want to punish them really hard. And I just want them to keep on sort of like building up sort of like the stuff that I can pour out the wrath on, because I want to make sure I can really give it to him. That's not how the Eastern Fathers read that. They read that as exceedingly patient. The fact that God does not give up on a person until it is clear that they are somehow beyond repentance. Now, the interesting thing here is then when you include in this the long narrative, the idea that their story is not over just because they've died, that they are still beings who exist in the realm of Hades until the story is closed, until we reach the final judgment, the story is still going. What you begin to see is even there, God does not abandon them. In the case of the Noahic rebels, yes, their sins are fully ripened. Yes, they need to be drowned and punished in the flesh as men because they are beyond repentance. But even there is still this intent to pursue their good, that providential desire for their good, for their salvation, for them to become what they are made to be, persists even when the extreme measure of death has taken hold. You see this also in the case of Pharaoh, right? So one of the things that happens is that in the passage about Pharaoh, one of the things that Origen hints at is, oh, and by the way, just because Pharaoh is drowned doesn't mean that his story ends. And that's again, it's the same sort of point that you find with the Noetic rebels. And this is something that is really intriguing about the ways in which the Eastern Fathers understand death. And we'll get back to this more fully. But the fact of the matter is, on the one hand, yes, they see death as an enemy. It is a corruption, right? What death is a corruption that has set in and is at work in our members, bringing about disease and illness, and ultimately the return of our flesh to the dust. But they also see it as a mercy. This is something that you see come out in Cyril of Alexandria, for example, when he's talking about Genesis. The idea being that in the fall of humanity, when we have taken on this corrupt state, you'll notice this in Genesis, right? That there's this worry, this concern that if man reaches out and eats from the tree of life in his corrupt state, he'll persist in this forever, and that would be a bad thing. The reason that that's highlighted, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, is because what has gone wrong is some sort of distortion of human nature that needs to be undone in the hope of redoing it. So the analogy that what you see, one of the analogies that emerges with Gregory of Nyssa and Basil of Caesarea, they both use it in different ways, is this idea of a pottery, right? Sort of a pot that's being made out of two different substances. And the two different substances represent the spirit, right? And it represents the flesh. And there's a certain proper order that those are supposed to represent, right? That your body and your passions are supposed to be brought in accord and aligned with nature, being properly ordered by the rational spirit, which raises it up to participate in God and operate in accord with nature. But in the fall, something has gone wrong. Something has become twisted. And again, we'll get to this when we talk about the narrative of the Eastern Fathers. But suffice it to say, the fall has created some sort of a distortion. And Gregory of Nyssa points out that, well, how do you fix that? If a potter was working on a pot out of two different types of substances, and that those substances are supposed to relate in a certain way, but something has gone wrong in the process of the formation, well, should he fire the pot? And Gregory says, no. If he does that, what happens is he makes the corruption permanent. What he needs to do is separate out the substances, unmake it in order to remake it. And this is what you see in figures like Cyril of Alexandria, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, where their idea is that death, yes, on the one hand, it is an enemy to be overcome, if by it we mean corruption. But on the other hand, the return, if what we're referring to is the return of the body to dust, then we are talking about a mercy. And that mercy is that God is unmaking man. Death is ultimately part of the process of remaking man, part of our redemption, that it is a necessary step, that we are unmade, the separation of the soul from the body, in the hope that we might be remade incorruptible in the resurrection from the dead. Now, again, I'm getting ahead of myself into the larger narrative, so we'll get back to that. But the importance of that is to highlight the very thing that I was talking about before. The idea is not that God does not ever perpetrate some sort of harm or punishment or pain or trial or anything like that. Obviously, not all of the evils that we see are perpetrated by God. Most of them are perpetrated by you and by me, as well as by demons and things like that. But when it comes to God's perpetration of punishment or of trials or some sort of affliction, there actually is a redemptive end. Just like in the case of sending our body back to the dust, the purpose is ultimately redemptive. It is like that surgeon who, though he values the health and the goodness and the wholeness of the body, and therefore would not just sort of cut it open or mutilate it arbitrarily. In the case of one that has cancerous members, this may be a necessary evil in order to restore it to health and healing. And that's how the Eastern Fathers understand the nature of, God sending or crafting or whatever, some sort of trial or suffering or pain or affliction or punishment or whatever it is. It's ultimately redemptive in nature, as it was for the Noetic rebels, as it was for Pharaoh, as it is for you and for me and for every saint that's ever gone through those trials, and they've in some way contributed to their proper formation. Okay, clearly I did not get through the entire explanation today, so this will definitely be a two-parter. And so I think that's a good place for us to stop for today. So you get part 2 of this episode coming at you next week. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.